The Arab Socialist Ba'ath Party. Very little confuses people unfamiliar with Arab politics, quite like mentioning their name. I've heard people swear by the Ba'ath movement, and I've also heard people swear at the Ba'ath movement. It gave us the likes of Saddam Hussein, Hafez al-Assad, and of course his son Bashar al-Assad, and has had an incomparable effect on the Middle East and on world politics as a whole. So what is Ba'athism? What is its ideology? Today we'll be discussing how it started and a little bit about its history. Just as a note, I will not be discussing Saddam Hussein, as he was part of the Iraq faction of the Ba'ath Party, which I cannot do justice unless I make a separate video on them. We will be covering the period from the formation of the Ba'ath Party in the 1940s to the 1970 coup that shaped the modern movement. Modern Ba'athism is its own unique beast, with Assadism and Saddamism that have to be discussed at length in their own video. The scope of this video is solely the origins of the Socialist Arab Ba'ath Party. Chapter 1. Formation of the Ba'ath Movement and Party. What is unique about the Ba'ath movement is that it was the first non-communist movement in the Arab world, a real yellow belly among the Reds. Prior to the Ba'ath movement, the only well-organized political movements in Arabia were the communist, the Syrian Communist Party being one of the most popular political parties in Syria at the time. True to its origins, the Ba'ath movement was formed from the discussions of very fragmented and informally defined groups that sought to examine and deal with Syrian and Lebanese issues with an eye on Arab liberation and unity that they peddled through leaflets and demonstrations. However, they lacked any semblance of a formal program for their ideas. That is until 1943, when Aflaq, who was considered the founder of the Ba'ath movement, ran for political office. When he ran for office, he outlined his political platform that Shibli al-Aysami summarized in his book, The Arab Ba'ath Socialist Party, the Formative Forties stage, as follows. Number 1. Emphasis on the dynamic nationalist idea, which represents the aspirations of the Arab people. Number 2. Emphasis on protecting the integrity and unity of Arab cultures from the fragmenting influences of Western culture. Number 3. Rejection of religious factionalism and localism. Number 4. Condemnation of communism, which represents an artificial material progress. Number 5. Emphasis on the freedom and unity of the Arab world. What is interesting about this platform is that there is no mention of socialism, and in fact it specifically rejects communism, which we'll examine further. But this is the political platform that the scholars consider proto-Ba'athism. The ideas presented at this stage can be most succinctly described as a form of liberal nationalism. The assumption was that freedom and unity were good enough to herald progress and justice, a very naive assumption that blindly ignored material conditions for idealism, a very important political marker for judging the political maturity of the formation of this movement. Changing the accents of your rulers is not enough for fundamental social change. Even the famous Ba'ath doctrinal slogan, freedom, unity, and socialism, did not come into being until 1949, and was not seriously considered as doctrinal until the 1960s. But let's get back to the formation of the party. There were all these nationalistic ideas floating around that were being codified by Aflaq and his associates, who then called a conference of all people who were interested in the ideas they expressed. In the book, The Struggle of the Ba'ath, that was published by Tareq, this conference is described as being held in a Rashid coffee shop in Damascus on April 4th to April 6th in 1947. Long-time listeners may confuse this for the Rashid coffee shop for the one in Tbilisi. However, this one has significantly more mustaches in it. The conference was attended by 200 delegates, mainly from Syria, but also a number of delegates from Jordan and Lebanon. The goals of this conference were discussion of the party constitution, election of the head of the party, called the Dean, election of 3 delegates to form the executive committee of the party, and discussion of political and ideological reports. This conference shows the first attempt by the Ba'ath Party to expound on their idea of socialism. As we'll see, Ba'ath socialism is considerably different from any other conception of socialism, and that it changed from time to time. In this first conference, socialism was defined as essentially liberalism, i.e. socialism only as a term to describe liberalism. The most explicit statement by the conference about their rejection of socialism in favor for liberalism was in one of their adopted assertions that can be found in the struggle of the Ba'ath Arab Socialist Party throughout its national congresses 1947 to 1964, published by Tareq once again, in which they stated socialism shouldn't limit the freedom of individuals. The owner of a factory is not necessarily and always a beast who exploits the work of laborers. He might be a creative inventor in industry whose genius results in progress for the country. Any person with a good understanding of socialism can see this is a very flagrant rejection of socialist principles. In fact, the Ba'ath Party became known for its strong anti-communism. Aflaq often stated that there were very large contradictions between Arab nationalism and communism. A later statement by the party further expanded on what the Ba'ath Party's role in relation to communism is. In fact, Aflaq and Salahuddin al-Bitar, who was one of the members of the first executive committee, stated in their book Arab Nationalism and its stance towards communism that we represent the Arab spirit against materialistic communism. This is why the party has always been engaged in a war against communism, which strangles both the human being's freedom and his ethical values. Shibli al-Aysami, one of the major scholars on the Ba'ath movement, noted in his book The Formative 40 Stage that in the intellectual legacy of the formative stage of the party, we do not find detailed scientific analytical studies of the class situation in Arab society, and certainly no advocation for the idea of class struggle. We do find in general terms attacks on feudalism, capitalism, and corrupt ruling elite, and a defense of the dispossessed classes. We also do not find any acceptance of dialectic materialism in the manner explained by Marxian theory. So you can see there's a very solid anti-communist fervor in the Ba'ath Party, even early on. Back to the conference, however. In addition to defining the group's conception of socialism, Aflaq was elected as the dean of the party. The constitution of the Ba'ath Party was also defined, which codified the three main aims of the Ba'ath Party as follows. Number 1. The Arab homeland is an indivisible political and economic unit, and it is impossible for any one of the Arab countries fully to realize the requirements of its life in isolation from any other Arab country. Number 2. The Arab nation is a cultural unity, and all the differences existing between its sons are accidental and spurious, and will pass away with the awakening of Arab consciousness. Number 3. The Arab homeland is for the Arabs, and they alone have the right to manage its affairs, dispose of its wealth, and direct its destinies. Following this conference, the Ba'ath Party was officially announced. In 1952, the Ba'ath Party merged with Akram al-Hurani's Arab Socialist Party and changed their name accordingly to be the Arab Ba'ath Socialist Party. The Ba'ath Party did this in order to gain supporters in the regions that the Arab Socialist Party had a strong base in, as well as to gain their deputies in the Syrian parliament. The Ba'ath Party then expanded its operations to have bases in Jordan, Lebanon, and Iraq. These branches were considered subordinate to the main branch in Syria, until 1954 when the National Command was put in charge of all the branches. This was an executive council elected from the leadership of the branches. But by now, the Ba'ath Party had stepped onto the scene. Chapter 2. The Syrian-Egyptian Union. In 1954, Syria re-established civilian rule after years of military rule, and an election was called, which proved the Ba'ath Party to be popular enough to win 17 seats in parliament. By 1956, the Ba'ath Party had control of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Economics in the National Union government. However, the Ba'ath Party was worried by the successes of the Syrian Communist Party and believed that a communist takeover of the country was imminent. So they played an instrumental role, along with other nationalists, in promoting unity between Syria and Egypt. The Ba'ath interest in Syrian-Egyptian unity was based off of fear of a communist takeover and in the possible achievement of one of their main goals, i.e. pan-Arab unity. However, soon they would be thrown a curveball by the Egyptian President Jamal Abdel Nasser, who insisted on the condition that if a Syrian-Egyptian Union would be formed, all political parties within Syria would be dissolved, and all political activity would be reduced to action within a single party, namely the National Union Party. This was based on Nasser's experiences in Egypt. The Ba'ath Party agreed to this, assuming that they would be easily able to control the National Union, and at their third conference, they passed a resolution to dissolve the Syrian branch of the Ba'ath Party in accordance with the conditions set by Nasser. Thus, Syria and the Ba'ath Party joined Egypt in forming the United Arab Republic. However, this created a genuine crisis of existence within the Ba'ath Party. The head branch of the party was suddenly dissolved. The party members, unable to make a strong stand on their own, were subsumed and overwhelmed in the National Union. So they did what most reactionaries are wont to do. They turned back. They called the previous conference to dissolve the Syria branch, attended by a lot of the same people, of course, as being ideologically unacceptable and motivated by defeatist and naive considerations. The depth of the division and separatism in the Ba'ath movement was immense. Since they had built their ideology on pillars of sand, the leadership itself was split. They had no ideological basis for opposing or supporting the United Arab Republic because most of their policy positions were based on slogans, instead of their slogans being based on their policy positions. They were for a unified Arab nation, but, some argued, not one where they weren't in power. Regardless, the Ba'ath Party did launch an extensive campaign to discredit the Union and its alleged undemocratic practices, saying that it had weakened Arab liberation. This campaigning inspired a coup to dissolve the United Arab Republic within little over 3 years of its formation. Thus the snake swallowed its own tail. Chapter 3. The formation of the modern Ba'ath movement. By 1963, the Ba'ath had orchestrated coups in Iraq and Syria, and seized power in both these states. This brings us to perhaps one of the most important moments in Ba'ath history, the moment it could have all been made alright: the Sixth Party Conference. The turmoil of the past few years had shown the lack of ideological basis for Ba'ath ideas, and the bolstering of Ba'ath ranks with Socialist inspired a new kind of basis for the party program: actual socialism. While Ba'athist politics are often defined as Arab socialism, we have seen how that is mostly just a label, and how the Ba'ath were inherently capitalist at their origin. But in their Sixth Party Conference, they retconned most of their previous assertions regarding the protection of property relations, and called their previous positions petty bourgeois socialism. It also rejected the claim that the middle bourgeoisie could be revolutionary, and instead focused on workers, peasants, and revolutionary intellectuals. The ideas of Michel Aflaq, the founders of the movement, were rejected soundly. But, once again, in typical Ba'ath fashion, this was hotly contested, and the contradictions between the different factions led to a total paralysis of the movement by the Seventh Party Conference. Another 2 coups occurred in 1964 and 1966. Both were done by members of the Ba'ath Party. The 1964 one was done by the right wing of the party. The coup in 1966 was done by the left wing of the Ba'ath Party. In 1966, the Syrian leadership, now composed of actual socialist Salah Jadid, accused the executive committee and the first dean of the Ba'ath Party, i.e. Michel Aflaq, Bitar, and Amin al-Hafez, of being right-wing reactionaries, and they were expelled from the country and from the party. Salah Jadid was the best hope for any socialist program that the Ba'ath could have hoped to implement. He represented a massive change in the party structure that seemed to gel so well with the working class politics that Syrians have been engaged in for decades. Salah Jadid was to the Ba'ath movement what Jeremy Corbyn was to the UK Labour Party in 2015. This man could have changed it all. There were now 2 main figures in the Ba'ath Party in Syria: Salah Jadid and Hafez al-Assad. Hafez al-Assad was the face of the right wing of the Ba'ath Party, and one of the emerging stars of the movement. He had a strong relationship with the military, which he exploited in his bid for power. And as you can probably tell from his surname, Hafez al-Assad did launch a plot in 1970 and arrested the leaders of the Ba'ath Party and nominated himself as the president. The right wing was now firmly again in charge of the Ba'ath Party, and Hafez al-Assad was now working to solidify his role as the sole leader of Syria and the Ba'ath Party. He declared the two founders of the Ba'ath movement, Michel Aflaq and Salah ad-Din al-Bitar, to be guilty in absentia and sentenced them to hanging. This sequence of events shows the final break from any semblance of ideology, first through the destruction of the left wing of the party, and then the liquidation of the old guard. Hafez al-Assad changed Ba'athism into something that was uniquely his own. In the 11th National Conference of the party, he was quickly elected as the General Secretary and drafted a notice that his coup was in fact a correctional movement towards Arab nationalism, despite the fact that his Ba'athism was a rejection of Pan-Arabism, and thus the modern Ba'ath Party had begun to take shape. And that is where I leave you. Hafez al-Assad, one of the most reactionary members of one of the most reactionary branches of the Ba'ath Party, on the seat of power in Syria. What happened next was the development of a cult of personality, the rejection of the basic Ba'ath principles of Arab unity in lieu for a protectionist approach, the reimposing of capitalism and the pushing for private property relations, the reorganizing of the state along sectarian lines, the increased centralization of control of the economy as a measure for increased personal power rather than socialist nationalization, and many more policies. His son, Bashar al-Assad, has gone in the same direction generally. A focus on nationalism and centralization of power rather than Arab nationalism or socialism that so many of its proponents attempted to give voice to. The Ba'ath Party is a perfect case study in the rudderless and destructive movements that arise from liberal nationalist policies. If your ideology has no philosophical and scientific underpinnings, anyone can grab it and make it what they want. They can mold the conceptions of the state, of power, of revolution, of nation, of socialism into any funnel they want. Even at its best, Ba'athism was never far enough away from a deformed implementation of Sasserism to not be pulled back eventually into reactionary nationalism. So what do we do? I would like to state forthright that I oppose any foreign intervention in Syria. This video is not meant to convince people to support forced regime change through military intervention. Unfortunately, that only makes things a million times worse. In fact, the two main strongholds of the Ba'ath Party, Syria and Iraq, have been bound back to the Neolithic by foreign adversaries claiming they are attempting to bring democracy and freedom to the Saracens. The Arabs have a long and rich history of political movements, freedom fighters, and liberation. They don't need another nation, especially one that was a crippled backwater when the Arabs and Persians were inventing the mathematic and scientific notions that we think in today. Finding good sources in the Ba'ath proved the challenge. There aren't a lot of substantial examinations of the origins of the party in English that aren't published by non-academics or just outright propaganda. The best book I found regarding this is called The Arab Left by Tareq, which I used as the basis for a lot of the primary sources I quoted, and was heavily influential in the rest of the video. I would recommend you give it a read. It's quite honestly one of the best primers on the Arab left-wing movements that I've seen in a long time, and since it's currently out of print, I'll put a link to the PDF in the description.